So first thing I want to do is say that this is, as Jim said, the fourth year that we've done the Trust Barometer. I was here a year ago and presenting the results. We've recently now had, so we have the Global Trust Barometer. We have a cut specifically as it relates to the tech industry. And we also have a cut as it relates to Samsung specifically. A lot of data about how people around the world feel about the company and their expectations on the company. All those together would be 100-some slides easily. I've cut this down to about 58 because I know that we've got limited time. I don't want to leave time for questions. Having said that, I'm going to share all the information. So if you were here last year, I'm going to go over some of the trust stuff a little bit quickly and maybe not in as much detail as we did last year, because I want to make sure that we get to the tech industry stuff, into the key findings and the behaviors, and then into the Samsung stuff as well. So again, I'll try to share this when we're done so you can get a little bit more detail. So this is the 19th year that Edelman has done the Trust Barometer. And for new folks, we talked to 33,000 people across the world. And what's important to note is that there are two types of people in the study, okay? There's the mass population, which is about 84% of the total global population that we poll, and then what we call the informed public. And the informed public are people that consume more news, they have a higher education, they make more money, they tend to be even a little bit older. So these are people that, again, follow the news a little bit more closely than the mass population. You're going to see why this matters. Okay, trust in retrospect. Every year we have some sort of a big reveal, some sort of a big finding, some sort of theme to what we found in trust. So for example, when you look around 2012 and 2011, rise of authority figures, fall of government, this is post-financial crisis, and we saw a lot of the effects after that. Leading up to last year and in 2016, we saw the trust in crisis. Right? That's when, for the first time that we've been doing it, and the Trust Barometer measures people's trust and faith in 4 institutions: NGOs, business, the media, and government. And right around 2016, 2017, we saw for the first time trust in all those different entities decline. Usually, if we were not trusting government, we were trusting NGOs. If we were not trusting business because of the financial crisis, we tended to give a little bit more trust to government. This is the first time, starting in 2016, 2017, we're just started a nosedive. And last year what we had, which was quite doomy and gloomy, but it was a battle for the truth. And that's when I stood and basically said is, we can't even agree what to disagree on. We're not speaking to each other, we're not trusting anyone, everything was falling, there was a huge divide, there was distrust all over. This year the theme is trust at work. And I'll explain that later on in the presentation. But first, let's start with a little bit of a level set. We are still awfully divided by trust, and not just in the United States, across the globe. We saw a modest rise, is what I would call a modest rise, in the trust levels in each of these entities, but none of them are really where I would call like trusted. And if you look here, because we're going to get back to this, this is the informed public, and how much they trust each one of those entities as it relates to last year. And this is the mass population, or the general population, right? So that's the more informed, higher education. This is everybody else. And look at the differences. While there was modest increase, we're still living in a world of distrust. People started to have a little bit more faith restored, but it's not anywhere near the kind of levels that we used to have. Distrust continues across the globe. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining this chart, but basically anything in the green category is what we would call distrust. Okay, this is a key takeaway. Last year we stood before and we talked about the ever-widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. So that's a little bit more direct term to talk about the informed public and the general population, right? It used to be tracking pretty similar. Back in 2012, there was about a 9-point gap. Generally, the more people were informed, and that informed public, the more they trusted those institutions because they felt like they could change them a little bit. When you're sitting in a good position and when the system is working for you a little bit, you tend to trust those entities that keep that system moving. And when it's not working so great for you, you tend to distrust them, which is intuitive. However, that said, the 16-point gap, which again, back to 2017 levels, is massive. That means you have a whole group of people who have a completely different view of the world than everybody else. So that gap continues, it widens, the distrust continues, we have a divide. Okay, for the first time we cut out this year and looked along gender lines. So not just socioeconomic status, but actually male, female. And as probably most of you could have guessed, the gap between the trusters on male side and female side is significant. In the US, it's a 15-point gap. Germany, 14. The UAE, just in business alone. But we're talking about double-digit differences between whether women believe the system is working for them, whether women have faith in the institutions that run the government and run the countries, versus men do. And I want to put a pin in this slide because we're gonna talk a little bit more about this later on. This is probably the no kidding slide, which is we still have a vast political divide in the United States. And you can tuck it's kind of interesting and intuitive, you believe, but look at the differences in terms of the trust. NGOs tracking somewhat similar if you use the rest of the chart as any sort of measurement. Business, much more faith, Republican side. Government, more faith on the Republican side.
Question for you. Does this invert depending on which party is in control or in the White House? So for example, would you see these things? That's the opposite.
Usually, but there's not that much of a gap usually. The call out here is really just the difference between the two. You do see it flip. The media is a huge one, obviously. I mean, this is usually around lows, frankly, but even when the Democrats are in charge, the Democrats hold the presidency, there's still much more trust in media. Business is about normal, I guess I would say. But yeah, you do tend to see that flip, especially with government and media. Okay, before I get into some of the detailed findings, again, I'm sorry, this is a little bit of a Franken deck because we got this information literally on, what is today? Thursday? I got it on Tuesday. So we're trying to decipher all of this still. But if you think about those, when we look at the business sector, so we say whether or not people trust business, we break it out by sector, right? So we try to look at retail, we look at health companies, we look at banks, and we also look at technology companies. Technology companies nowadays, frankly, is sort of the most complex because technology companies tend to fall into multiple categories. Like Samsung is obviously a technology company. Is Facebook a technology company? Or are they a social media company? Is Google a technology company? Or are they a search entity? Are they a platform? And so the lines start to blur a little bit, and I think what we're going to find next year is we may even try to break that out further. Okay, tech is by far the most trusted sector of all of them, from energy to food and beverage, automotive, education, manufacturing, all of it. That's a pretty clear trend that's happened the whole time we've looked at the trust barometer. But it is a complicated relationship these days. Before, it used to be very cut and dry. About 5 years ago, everyone trusts tech because technology was making their life better. They could enjoy it more. They couldn't wait for the next product to come out. Now that we're seeing some of the emerging technologies, this is over the past probably 3 or 4 years, we're looking at some data and privacy issues. They still like it when you ask them in general, but there's a little bit more dynamic to it. Trust in technology increases in 17, 26 markets. Hang on a minute. Okay, it's a weak foundation, and I'm going to try not to get over technical about how we did this chart, but we basically asked them, the people, of how much you trust technology on a scale from 1 to 9, right? The 8 and 9 are up in the blue category in terms of how much they actually trust them. And all these down here, it says 6, 7, not, it incorporates the other ones as well. All right, sorry, no, that's just the 6, 7, and below it is even worse. There's a cautionary tale to the trust in technology. It's not built on much. If you ask in general, do you like technology? Oh, yeah, sure, it's great. Well, how do you feel about data privacy? Well, I'm kind of scared about that. How do you feel about how do you feel about AI, artificial intelligence? Well, I'm not really sure about that either. Right? So it's as we start to break this down a little bit and they start to realize what it is, and I'll tell you also what's driving a lot of distrust is if they categorize them as social media companies. This is not a place that we're going to go today simply because I had to take something out. But if I was here last year, we talked about the fact that for the first time, we started to see a decline in social media as a trusted source of information. We looked at social media, earned media, owned media, and search. Now, earned media, like traditional media, is skyrocketing. Social media is dropping out the bottom. And it's because you can't trust what you read. And you're choosing what you want to read. One of the things we talked about last year was the fact that we couldn't agree on information, so people weren't even looking at outlets and publications and posters that didn't agree with them. You know, there's that block button on Facebook for a reason. There's multiple channels. You can watch MSNBC, you can watch Fox News, depending on your political leaning, but there are not a lot of Democrats watching Fox News and there's not a lot of Republicans watching MSNBC. There's a divide there. And social media is really going down. There's a concern about tech companies' power over information. There's starting to become a belief because these platforms, Google, Facebook, any other kind of social platform, Twitter, what have you, they feel like they're having a little bit too much control over what people see. If 91% of the people in America today, I can just speak to America on this stat, get their news first from social media. It's the tip of the spear, it's the entry point. When they wake up in the morning, they open up Twitter, they open up Facebook, they open up Snapchat, whatever. And then if they like an article, then maybe they'll go to a different platform. So again, this is where the lines start to blur between technology companies and social media. We're going to look at a couple of different emerging technologies. And I've told you before, and I've stood on this stage before there was a stage, is the fact that there's concern over the emerging technologies of AI, automotive driving, IoT. I think those are the only three that we looked at this year. But there's always been a little bit, over the past couple of years, a little bit of hands-off approach. They thought technology was moving too quickly. And it was mainly because they didn't understand it. Because when you're thinking about AI, a couple of years ago, like now when we think about AI, we think about Alexa, we think about Bixby, we think about all the different voice assistants, we think about the possibility of autonomous driving, and we're starting to understand what it looks like. But there was a little bit of a scariness to it not too long ago. So as people start to understand these emerging technologies, you're going to see a pretty good bump all across the region. I mean, I wouldn't call it monster hits or anything. It still wouldn't call it massively trusted in a lot of the most, in some of the emerging countries it is, but not over here in the US and Germany, Ireland, France, Australia, and the UK. It's certainly below those trust levels, but it's starting to creep up as people start to read about it. Likewise with autonomous and self-driving vehicles. Now, I think we're getting a little bit of bump on the autonomous vehicles because last year, right before we did this survey, was when they had the crash. So I think that might have been fresh on people's mind, but it's a little bit higher than some of the other emerging technologies, but it's still moving up. Trust in artificial intelligence, a pretty solid bump. Again, this is anecdotal, but we credit this just the fact that people are starting to hear more about it and they're starting to feel a bit more comfortable and they start to realize what it is. But all in all, with technology, there's still a little bit of a sensitivity issue, right? They love their tech, like tech companies, trust tech companies, but things are moving very, very quickly, and especially in some of these emerging technologies, social media, if they lump them in with tech companies, and data privacy and security are on top of people's minds. So let's get back to the trust barometer. So we see there's division. We see from last year, it hasn't changed. There's still a distrust of information that either side is giving. We can't agree on the fact. There is wide division, wide distrust all across the globe. But what we're seeing is a massive and urgent desire for change. This part is about activism. This is about how people are reacting. We stood on the stage last year and when I just went through all the terrible numbers about they don't trust them and they don't trust them, and somebody asked me, well, you know, what's the way out? I didn't quite know the answer to that because it felt a little bit unprecedented, so I sort of mumbled the way through like a political answer, but I think we're seeing the way out. I think we're seeing the results of what's happening, and what's happening is activism. Okay, let me show this. Urgent desire, fear is what drives distrust. Fear, just as I said before about technology, why it's soft, they're a little bit scared of things. And right now, what's driving it right now is the percentage of employees, these are employees that that are currently employed, they're scared of losing their jobs. They don't feel they have the necessary training and skills to get a good paying job. They're afraid of automation and other innovations taking their job away. And they're really concerned about international conflicts and trade policies and tariffs hurting the company you work for. Okay, so this is setting up that distrust. This is the fear. The developed world is very concerned about the future because of those fears. This is kind of an age-old political question. It's sort of, do you feel like you're better off now than you were 4 years ago? And do you think your kids are going to have access to the American dream or access to the life that you had before? Overwhelmingly in the developed countries, the answer is no. They do not feel that their kids are going to be better off than they were. Taking change in their own hands. We have seen this all across the country. We've seen this all across the world. Seen it in India. You've seen it at companies where people, whether they're walking out on Google, Salesforce, Amazon, the India's women's ball, people are taking activism into their own hands. And this is very important for companies to understand how this dynamic is developing, because they want to make change happen. So we did a study last year called Earn Brand. And basically what it was is we were asking consumers whether or not how they felt about a company affected their buying habits. So if I like what Starbucks does from a corporate social responsibility standpoint, does that make me more likely to go buy Starbucks coffee? And overwhelmingly the answer is yes. If I like Samsung in terms of what they do and how they treat their employees and whether or not they engage on issues, the answer is yes. What prompted us to do that survey is last year, well, we actually done it for a couple of years, but we really dug in deep last year, was Nike and Colin Kaepernick, Levi's taking a stand on gun control, REI getting involved. These were companies making incredibly bold moves and taking very controversial stands on issues. And we wanted to explore what consumers thought about that. And overwhelmingly, consumers said that was very important to them, but also they felt like they could affect that change. So not only do I need to see from a company that they have a good product, I need to see that they're doing well and they're a good corporate citizen, and then I'll shop there. And if I don't like what they're doing, I won't shop there. And I think I can affect the way they behave and how they change and change the world based on how I vote with my wallet. In politics, I don't think my vote matters so much, but I think my money matters a lot, and I think I can dictate the way a company changes. So that expectation that we found on Earn Brand is that in the marketplace, consumers had higher expectations on companies and they wanted to see them take stands. Now, not everyone has to go be Nike and Colin Kaepernick. There's 3 or 4 levels, below that, but they certainly have to be talking about themselves as a good employer, talking about themselves as a good corporate citizen, and being able to demonstrate to their employees and to consumers that they are ready to engage in some of the global issues. They don't have to be controversial. They can be things as simple as clean water, technology into classrooms like we do, things like that. They just want to start to see it. And the reason I'm setting this up is that's what we saw with Earn Brand. This year what we're seeing is a new dynamic with the employees. But first, I've got a little bit ahead of myself. Let me see, I want to figure out how to set this up, because I'm going to do this all out of order. Okay, activism is obviously all those things that I talk about in those demonstrations. But one of the biggest changes that we saw in the Trust Barometer this year was first, 22% higher. People are more engaged with the news. So there's the disengaged that consume news and information less than once a week. There are the consumers who consume news about weekly or more, and then there are the amplifiers. The amplifiers are the ones who not only read news, but then go talk about it, or share it, or get involved and participate in the conversation. There's a 14-point jump, 22 points overall, between last year of people who called themselves amplifiers to 40% this year. All in all, the number of people, the disengaged, which was nearly half of the people we surveyed last year, nearly half, said they were not consuming news more than once a week. And now that number is down to 28%. So this is the activism piece that's happening. It seems like on a small scale, but that's still pretty significant, and it's pretty positive. We talked about last year about what the change is and how do you get out of this. We probably start by engaging. And women are far more considered amplifiers than men. They are far more likely. A 13% jump in women from 2018 to 2019. With informed public, a 23% jump.
On the previous slide, what do you think there was the effect of the midterm elections?
I think significant. I happen to think so because I live in Washington, D.C., but I think it was significant. It was kind of the first time, and again, if we're just speaking about the U.S. and this is global, but I think there were lots of, quote unquote midterm elections all over the world, but it was the kind of a forced dialogue. So if we think about the year before, when we weren't even talking to each other at all, it's kind of, you were going to this source and listen to this, and this source or listen to that. This is where it sort of all came together, I think, a little bit at a head, and you couldn't really avoid those two commonalities. So I think that certainly made a big difference in this, and especially with women, obviously. So as a result of all this, so people are engaging more, they're taking in more news, we don't trust social media, we're starting to trust traditional media a little bit more, we want to have change, they're looking for reasons to engage. They're looking for places to change. They were looking for reliable sources. 73% worry about false information or fake news being used as a weapon. Now, they don't mean it literally as a weapon, but they do mean it in terms of dividing us further. They do mean it in terms of getting false information out there and having us not be able to agree with the facts. So there's a low trust in social media, because I think that the dynamic of fake news, I think might have started in traditional media. It has quickly gone to social media. People just don't trust what they see unless they really know the source and the person doing it. So they're looking for reliable sources. They want to engage, they want to amplify, they want to activate. And they're looking for leadership from their CEOs. So this is the setup now to where we're going with all this. Percentage who agree CEOs could create positive change in equal pay, prejudice and discrimination, training jobs of tomorrow, the environment, personal data, sexual harassment, fake news. The CEO has risen 11 points. CEOs have kind of had a rough ride on the trust barometer. There was the skyrocketing up until like 07, 08, 09, and then the financial crisis happened, and then it just went downhill. They've kind of bumped back and forth here and there, but they're starting to rise back up again. And to be clear, when we talk about CEOs, I'm not being literal in that sense. We're talking about like faces of the company, executives at the companies. It doesn't have to be the CEO, but it does have to be C-suite and leadership, someone giving some kind of voice to what the company stands for. Excuse me. So when we asked them whether or not they were looking for leadership from their employer, 71 employees agree. It is critically important for my CEO to respond to challenging times, industry, political, national, and employee-driven. So this is asking you now not about do you think CEOs should engage or do you trust business to engage. We're asking about your company in specific. Do you trust them and do you expect them to engage on these issues? And 71 says yes. My employer, a trusted partner for change. The employer, your employer, is by far the most trusted relationship. So if we go back to NGOs, business, government, and media, my employer is the most trusted. I might be jumping ahead here, so I'm going to try not to. Hang on a minute. But think about that for a second. So go back to what I said before about earned brand, right? Consumers believed that they could affect change and affect a company's way of doing business and interacting on issues by voting with their wallet. They felt they had some sort of control. This is the dynamic we're seeing here. Employees trust their relationship with their business, with their company, because they think they can affect that change. Because they think two things is, number one is, I won't work there if they don't. I'll just leave. And number two is, inside I can affect and I can be active, I want to be inspired, and I expect that from my company. But they believe they can just leave. So they feel, again, just like we had in the marketplace with purchasing power, they could make a difference. Here, employees think they can do the same thing. Employers trusted even by the disenfranchised. So we go before about the mass population and how the informed public always tends to have more trust because of the system working. Even here, mass population agrees 72% that they trust their employer. People who say for a fact that I believe the system is failing me, 71% of them say that they trust their employer. 73% of women say they trust their employer. Only a 4-point gap between the men, which is pretty significant. It doesn't sound exactly right, but if you think about it in terms of that relationship, if you think about it in terms of what's going to inspire employees, they do believe that they can make that change and affect it. Employers trusted to provide certainty. I look to my employer to be a trustworthy source of information about social issues and other important topics on which there is not a general agreement. Employees see business as a trustworthy source on the global economy and technology. So there's that expectation. They're looking for your company to give you that information, to provide it. When you think about all the different sources, traditional media, social media, own channels, search, all kind of going up and down and feeling a little bit out of control, they feel a little bit centralized at their places of business. So it's an opportunity for companies and, frankly, an expectation on companies and a responsibility to make sure that they're providing that clarity. This brings us to the theme of this year's Trust Barometer, which is trust at work. So when things are bad, when there is distrust, when there is division, people are looking for something to believe in, and they're looking for a place that they can affect change. And the dynamic that we've seen is a lot of people are viewing that as the place that they work. Oh, there we go. Employees' expectations now include societal change. So we were just talking about this before. Before, when you go work for a company, you want to know how much they were going to pay you. Maybe something about your benefits and vacation time. But now there's about, I want to be personally empowered. I want to know what's going on. I want to be part of the planning process and a voice in key decisions. I want to know more about what the company stands for. It used to be just about the paycheck. My employer has a greater purpose and my job has a meaningful societal impact. They want to know this. So if you look at here, in terms of the expectations, 38%, where am I? Personal empowerment. 31% of the people say, if I don't believe that about my job, it's a deal breaker, I won't work there. 1 in 4 about shared action will not work there. It's a deal breaker for them. The rest of it's strong expectation. So you're starting to see these things like personal empowerment, shared action, social responsibility, trusting in your employer. It's just as important to employees as it is a paycheck. Meeting employee expectation builds resilient trust. So this is percentage of people who trust their employer by the degree which employee expectations are met. I took out a slide that explained this, so I'm going to try as best I can. This is when you're asking employees about different characteristics of a company, similar to the 3 that we just mentioned, about whether if you believe they are doing those things and you know they're doing those things, do you trust them more? And if the answer is yes, we not only saw that with employees, we saw that all across the world. So people in general also want to know, even if they don't work there, that the company is actually giving and empowering the employees to activate. Trust cements the employer-employee partnership. This is percentage of employees who engage in these types of behaviors on behalf of their employer. So this is if they trust their employer, they will advocate for the employer, they will be loyal and stay with the employer, they will engage on behalf of the employer, and they'll have a stronger commitment to the employer if they believe that they're doing all those things that we just talked about, right? So this is a little bit about employee retention, to be sure, but it's also about employee being an advocate for you, about being an ambassador for you, about talking good about the company and getting out there, because people like to hear from employees about what a company is doing. Because when you ask people about who they trust when talking about a company, who they trust with information about a company, it's a company technical expert number one, academic, a person like yourself, and a regular employee. These are all people that touch the company in some way. So when you do those things well, you get advocacy, loyalty, engagement, and commitment, and those people can go out and talk about and help the company from a reputation standpoint. So again, to summarize where we've gone, is employees are looking for something to believe in. They believe they can affect change with their employer, and there's expectations on the employers and companies to do better, represent on the issues, and advocate for their employees. And when you do that, you have employees that are more loyal and will advocate for you. Investing in your employee trust is investing in your bottom line. How a company treats its employees is one of the best indicators of the level of trustworthiness. Percentage that agree a good reputation may get me to try a product, but unless I come to trust the company behind the product, I will soon stop buying it. So again, that's related to earned brand. But part of the company's reputation is how they treat employees. So if you have employees that are out there talking about it, I'm sure you guys get a lot in Silicon Valley. You have friends and hear about how they work for a company that does this. We just talked about one that allows dogs in Seattle. You know, that's the kind of stuff that really resonates with people when they think about the culture of a company. Companies can improve society and do well. This is a dynamic that we've seen for like the past 10 years, is whenever you ask people, it didn't start with this, but I remember in 2005, 2006, we were working for Walmart. And at Walmart, they made a decision that they were only going to go to concentrated laundry detergent. I may have told this story here before. I know I've told it before. But they said, we're only going to sell concentrated laundry detergent because that saves us millions of dollars in shipping charges. And we're Walmart and we like to be cheap, right? When they did that, they also reduced waste by like tons and tons and tons every single year. They didn't do it to reduce waste, they did it to reduce cost. But they got a huge reputation boost from that because they were transparent about why they were doing it. That was kind of at the beginning of a trend, but I think it's a good example of a trend that's been building probably for the past 12 to 15 years, in the sense that people believe that, look, sure, a company's supposed to make money, we get it, but we think you can also do well. So what that's doing is that's translating, again, from the marketplace to employees. They want to be part of something that's doing better. So trust at work, the new employer-employee contract. So these are kind of the 4 steps now that we know this, and we know employees care so much about what their company is doing. So what does companies do in that regard then, right? How do they demonstrate to their employees that they also care about these things and they're taking a stand? Number 1 is they lead change. Be aspirational and address concerns about the personal impact of change and train the workforce for the future. Remember the fears. People want to know the businesses and their companies understand those fears and are doing something to address it. They want to help alleviate those fears that they're going to be, that they're going to lose their jobs because of technology. Empower employees, give them a voice, and create opportunities for shared action. Again, people are searching for some ways to effect change. They're searching for someone to believe and a good source of information. Give them every opportunity to amplify that and go out there and be an ambassador. Start locally, solve problems at home, and improve societal conditions in your local communities where you operate. This has always sort of been a little bit of a no-brainer for companies, and actually it used to be they were so focused in, I'll pick on Walmart again, but they're so focused like on Bentonville, Arkansas, and all the different things that were happening in Northwest Arkansas, that they really didn't do a good job of being a global company for a while. Now they do a fantastic job of doing it. But you do have to kind of go back and remember you have to take care of your localities first. We've gone almost the other way. CEO leadership. Live your values, engage directly, be visible, and show a personal commitment inside and outside the organization. This doesn't have to be an iconic CEO figure, but this does mean participating in thought leadership events, making sure that executives are visible, talking about the industry, talking about societal changes, talking about issues where appropriate. You don't have to be Nike, you don't have to be Levi's and take such a radical stance, but talking about all the different problems that the world faces and how your company and industry are part of that solution is an important thing to do. So I'm going to stop there for a minute. I'm not sure, what time is it? Oh, 12, oh good, so we have some time. So I'm going to stop there for some questions before I get into the Samsung specific data.
You mentioned trust in automated vehicles seems to be going up a little bit. You know, it's kind of most of the studies we've seen come out, particularly in the last 6 months. American public in particular seems really, really hazy on it. What do you find the discrepancies between the polls we're seeing here and the research you guys did?
Because it's global.
Gotcha.
I think in the US you see it much softer and global. I think, I don't know if I know it's sort of weak right now, but it's stronger than it was.
Yeah.
I think again, because I think at the time that we did last year, at least what we've seen with this research project with the US, it's gotten a little bit of a bump, but globally it's gone up much more.
Gotcha.
And I just think as the conversations evolved around it. But I think in the US we're so much closer, right? And so I think there's probably some fears there and a little bit of hangover from what happened last year.
Well, in China as well, their trust for this technology is much higher, but they're also deploying it much quicker as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. That makes sense.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah.